Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Newark Museum of Art at Home. We're pleased to have you with us today, and we're very pleased to have our special guest, Monk Inyang, with us, who's joining us for our virtual book club. I'm Stephen Hyland, Manager of Public Programs at the museum. And so today we're talking to Monk about his young adult novel, Nightmare Detective: The Skeleton King. Monk is a husband and father of two from Newark, New Jersey, and he enjoys creating adventures that represent the neighborhoods he grew up in. Thank you, Monk, for joining us. I see we have a few people coming in. So I guess you have a presentation, Monk. Can we pull that up? Great. So, Monk, I'm going to hand over to you to take us away, talk about your great book.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys having me on. Again, my name is Monk. I am the author of the series The Nightmare Detective, and the book has been a labor of love for me for a few years, and kind of just wanted to talk to everybody about the book, about what brought it to where it is today, and why books like this are important in today's world. A little bit about myself. I grew up in Newark, went to school in Newark, and came from an immigrant family. My parents are Nigerian, and we basically grew up in North Newark, and then moved to West Newark. And ever since I was small, I was really into writing, telling stories, really drawn by great storytellers. And it was a hobby of mine that I kind of just left to the side for a while until I got older and decided that I wanted to make a book that kind of captured that imaginative storytelling that I really loved when I was younger, and then also was really representative of my community and the people that I grew up with, and the characters sounded like people I grew up with, and really just kind of embraced that storytelling that we don't get too much of, that hopefully we continue to get more of. So a quick synopsis of the book. It's a middle grade book for, I guess the perfect age range would be, anywhere between like 5th and like 9th grade. But adults have enjoyed it as well. And it basically tells the story of Uko. And Uko's the main character. He's a boy living in Newark who has this recurring nightmare where every night he goes to sleep and there are basically these skeletons that break into his house, rip everything up, and then he wakes up. And it happens to him again and again and again. He doesn't know what's going on. His parents are concerned. No one knows how to figure this thing out. And then one day, this girl, Tony, shows up in his dream, and basically says, listen, I know this is freaking you out, but I'm a real person. I live in Georgia. I'm a part of this group called the Nightmare Detectives. And what we do is we help kids get over their nightmares by helping them solve the mystery that's going on in their nightmare. I've met you multiple times, and I'm here today because I have to retire because I'm going to high school, and I need to find my replacement, and I want you to be my replacement. So do you want to join the Nightmare Detectives and replace me as a part of the group? So he has this struggle about whether he's going to do it. He says no the first time, and then eventually agrees to do it. And the book really centers on his process to learn what it takes to be a nightmare detective, his relationship with Tony and how that grows, because she is the version of him that he would want to be. She's very confident. She knows what she wants. She's she's the cool kid that he wishes that he always was. So his relationship with her grows as she teaches him the ins and outs of going into people's nightmares, helping them without doing it for them, and getting him to a place to understand why he's having his own nightmare and how to kind of solve that mystery. So the book is the first in a trilogy of 3 books that would kind of chronicle what happens to Ugo and the different people that he meets as he goes into this dream world, which is called Pangea. and he meets different people and finds out that it's, you know, a lot more than what he thought it was at the very beginning, and that we're all kind of connected through these dreams. So this first book came out in in September of 2018, and the second book is going to come out in this September. So hopefully, third book will come soon after that. But you know, we're continuing the story and continuing the process of really kind of getting into this world and everything that it means to everybody involved. So we can go to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about how we kind of got to this. So the first part of the process was basically figuring out, you know, what nightmares that I want to kind of cover, and then finding a way to like bring that to kind of fruition. And so in like 2017, I literally just put a Facebook post out and I said, does anybody remember any nightmares that they have? And, you know, if you do, what was like the worst one that you've ever had, and describe it to me. And a bunch of people kind of reached out and said, oh, I had these nightmares about this, and, you know, being late for school or different things like that. And a friend of mine, Chelsea, had a nightmare that was about having like these skeleton creatures breaking into her house. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And I said, you know what, I think that's going to be the like recurring nightmare that Uko has, and what will kind of set it all off. So I started off with that and kind of dreamed up what the characters would look like. And then I reached out to Elijah Johnson, who's the illustrator of the book. I've actually never met him in person. I kind of reached out to him online, and basically I've seen some of his work and said, you know, I think your work is great. I'm doing this, you know, middle school book, and I would love if you would do the illustrations in the book. And so he agreed, and we basically kind of connected, and I'd send him my ideas before I went to bed, and then the next morning he'd send me a sketch and say, like, this is what I'm thinking, and we'd go back and forth. And it was a great process. He made the cover of the book and all the illustrations inside the book. And what you see on the left is the illustration for the very first chapter, which kind of shows Uko opening the door and seeing these like Grim Reaper looking skeletons standing at his door. And there's always water around, and it's always this really surreal experience. And Elijah did an incredible job in making this first, all the illustrations in this book. But I think that this one really shows like kind of the depth of his talent and what he did to bring that idea that started off on Facebook and kind of bring it to life in the book. So if we go to the next slide. So part of making the story and kind of going through it was the idea of representation and why that's really important. On the left, this is a drawing that basically kind of shows Black Panther and the idea that, you know, both kids saying that's me and seeing themselves in that poster, in that movie. And part of when I was going through the process of creating the story, one of the things I really wanted to be authentic was that the characters looked like people from my neighborhood and talked like people from my neighborhood. So it was really important because when I grew up, it was hard to find someone who looked like me in stories, and it had gone on that so long that I was just used to it. I just didn't expect to see myself in a story or to see anyone that looked like me in a story. And if I did, it would be maybe about history and the history of maybe the civil rights movement or something like that. But, you know, the things that really interested me and the fantasy and all those things, we just didn't show up in those. So when I reached out to Elijah and kind of came up with the character designs and talked about what I wanted people to look like, he sent, you know, these are some of his early sketches as far as like what he, you know, through our conversation as far as what people looked like. And I just kind of fell in love with it and just thought that, you know, there's a level of, there's something really important when you're able to see yourself in different situations because it affects children, it affects adults, when you do or don't see yourself in different areas. So, you know, Black and brown kids think about fantasy and dreams, and we enjoy the same stories just like everyone else. So it's important to see that in the stories that we read as well. So you can go to the next one. So with that, you know, each of the chapters kind of had an illustration that basically showed kind of what happened in the chapter. And this is one of my favorites. This is actually the moment that Uko meets Tony. He's hiding. He's in his closet. He's hiding from the skeletons, and she kind of just appears. And the color that's kind of coming from her kind of contrasts what's going on around him. He's kind of at his lowest moment, and she's the ray of sunshine that kind of steps into his life. And that relationship that they had is something that I really drew upon and kind of wanted to really flesh out, and turned out a lot of the readers really connected to that. And I'll go into that in more depth in the next one. So Tony and Uko are the main characters in the story. Tony is basically a middle school kid. She's in 8th grade, graduating, going to 9th grade. And Uko is going into middle school. He's going into 6th grade. And the idea of the Nightmare Detectives is it was this group that was formed by a middle schooler several years ago. And the idea is that they kind of go around and help other kids with their nightmares. And then as they get older, when you become more cynical and your imagination's not the same as it was when you were younger, you've kind of got to basically, you age yourself out. You've got to retire, and you've got to find a replacement. So as we go through the story, we see the relationship between Tony and Uko kind of grow, where she kind of teases him a lot as she's trying to get him up to speed and brings him through everything that goes on in Pangea. So on the right, we have an example of what's called the Dream Hub in the story. And the idea of the Dream Hub is essentially that before you go into any particular dream, there's a place where there's this fog where you can kind of see everything that's going on in this world. It's not really clear. It's almost like looking into like a cauldron for a witch or something like that, where it's just kind of bubbly and you don't really understand what's going on. But as you get better at this process, you're able to kind of jump to the dreams that you want to jump to. So that illustration, which again, Elijah did an incredible job on, is an idea of what it would look like, where Tony's kind of, showing him like, this is the Dream Hub, and we get to choose where we want to go, and there's different things going on all at once, and he, she represents that entry into this new world that kind of gets him to grow up a lot faster and changes his relationships with his friends, with his parents, because of what he goes through with her. You can go to the next one. So through the story, it's full of a lot of different adventures and things that he has to solve. In his training, Tony basically tells him that, you can't really graduate to big boy dreams yet. You need to help toddlers in their dreams because they're a little bit more silly and easier to deal with. So this is an example of one of the dreams that he has in his Nightmare Detective training, where he has to help this toddler who's running away from dinosaurs. But even then, when he gets into the dream, he realizes that it's a lot more serious than he thought it would be, and it scares the crap out of him too. But each story or each dream that he goes through, he fails sometimes, but he eventually gets better at it to kind of get to the point where he's able to whether he's able to join the Nightmare Detectives or not. We can go to the next one. So, like I said, I'm a kid from Newark, and I wanted to have Newark as a part of the story. So one of the things that happens in the story is this Newark Literary Festival, which is a festival that I made up where essentially people come from all over the state. They get dressed as their favorite book characters, and there's just a full day celebration of literature. So I think it'd be a great thing if it happened in real life. But there's plays, and there's like skits and food and things like that. And in the story itself, in Nightmare Detective, this is a part of something that the boys kind of go through and find a clue to something that's going on in the dream world. And it kind of makes the connection between what he's going through when he's asleep and what he's going through when he's awake, because he has that moment of wondering whether all of this is real or not. And the adventure he goes through in the library is a part of that. So throughout the story, there are, Newark landmarks and things like that I kind of wanted to reinforce and center it in, in the city that I grew up in. And I think that's the last one. So the last, so this has just kind of been the reaction since I've released the book. It's been an incredible blessing to be able to speak to kids about, what they liked about it, what kind of resonated with them. I did the book release at the Newark Public Library, which was always a dream of mine. So I got an opportunity to kind of talk to people about the book and talk to them about what it meant and some of the messages that were in the book. And so it's been an incredible experience to share that with people and hear their thoughts about what should happen next, and hear their thoughts about what they felt was important and what they felt was secrets that were being held in the story. At the bottom actually is Elijah, the illustrator in the red, holding the copy that I sent to him after we finished it all up. So it's been a great ride, and it's something I'm looking forward to continuing. Like I said, the next book, I'm hard at work at that, finishing it up so that we can release it in September and kind of continue that story.
Thank you, Monk. That was great. Hearing about the kind of concept to kind of completion, that was really great. Just to mention to all of our viewers that if you have any questions, please ask. If you're watching on Zoom, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. And if you're on Facebook, you can enter a comment and we'll try and get to as many questions that come up. So we have one question already. So Monk, someone would like to know, how long did it take to write the full book?
That's a good question. So it's, for me, I think from the moment I first started writing it to completion was a year. It's different for different people. And the year that I spent writing it was a lot of like starts and stops, periods where I would just stop doing it, kind of give up for a little while and then come back to it. But I would say, yeah, it took about a year, or if I was to just say the time that I was really focused on doing it, maybe 4 months of really like pure writing.
Cool. And so you mentioned that this is part of like a series of 3. Could you tell us, give us a teaser about the part 2? Is there a title you have already?
Yeah. So the second book, so the first one is Nightmare Detective, the Skeleton King, and the second book is going to be Nightmare Detective, the Oracle's Blessing. And essentially what happens is, the first book takes place in the summer before Ugo goes to middle school. And then in the second book, he is a nightmare detective. He goes into middle school and he has to kind of deal with being further into Pangea and this dream world while going to a new school. So he meets some different people and finds out some history about this dream world and how there are factions of people who've been in this war before he ever came, and he has to kind of figure out what he's going to stand for in Pangea.
Cool. I look forward to it. A question from me is, In a previous conversation, you mentioned that Toni is named after Toni Morrison. Could you tell us a little bit about your kind of literary influences and how they've kind of made their way into your book?
Yeah, definitely. So Toni Morrison was a writer that had a significant impact on me. I was introduced to her in high school, actually, and like most high school kids, I didn't really pay attention to like what I was reading and like the impact of it. But she, as I got older, I kind of appreciated her ability to convey emotion and what it does to someone to deal with trauma and racism and things like that. So I named Toni after her, and throughout the story, there are different references to other Black authors that I've always been a fan of. I think growing up, I read a lot of just general fiction. But as I got older, I grew a real appreciation for Stephen King, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, learning more about, some of the stories that I wasn't exposed to as I got older or as I was younger, and now have the opportunity to go back and understand. So it's been great.
Cool. We have some more questions. So this question is about the references to Newark. Do you know how many references to Newark are in the book? And maybe you could speak to like any of the specific ones, whether it's other buildings or neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, so Uko lives outside of Branchbrook Park, and so he lives in North Newark, outside of Branchbrook Park, and so a lot of the story outside of the dream world happens in his neighborhood, in Branchbrook Park. He is kind of like me, where I just kind of enjoyed being outside as a kid and just poofing around outside. So there's that. There's the library, and in the second book, I kind of expand that more with additional references. I might have some Easter eggs for people to find out later on.
Cool. We have a couple of questions asking about what advice you would give to any young authors or aspiring authors in order to kind of realize their dream of writing and releasing a book.
Yeah, I think some really good advice is to write. So and it sounds simple, but the executing it is very difficult because we are our own worst critic. And so even this book was an example of kind of giving up. And there were times where this would have never happened because I would just get down on myself and say, like, this is not good. No one's going to enjoy this. This is not, worth the effort. And then you have the times where maybe you do show it to someone and they're not really receptive of it. So creating art is really personal, and really you're really putting yourself out there and really kind of taking a chance. So for a young artist, a young writer, it's basically building up that courage to just keep doing it. You're not doing it for anyone else. You're not doing it for the recognition. You're just doing it to get your story out. And for anyone who is the parent or the friend or the mentor of someone who's interested in art, just can keep encouraging them to keep going forward. Influence them with other artists who've done it, and let them know that failure is just a part of it. It's going to happen, and you're gonna create stuff that you hate. I have stuff that I look back on and I'm like, I cringe. I'm like, I can't believe I wrote that, but it's a part of the process. So just keep encouraging the process, and trust the process.
Great. I guess on the back of that, there were a couple of questions about writer's block. Like if you've ever experienced writer's block, if you have, how do you deal with it? And also, kind of more specifically to the book, was there any point where you didn't know how the situation or nightmare would kind of end, or kind of continue through?
Yeah, so those are good questions. So for writer's block, I've definitely had writer's block, and I for me, music is really helpful. I like listening to music. I like listening to rap, reggae, different things, and it's inspiring to kind of like imagine. I do this thing where I might listen to a song and then just imagine that the kind of the way that movies have soundtracks that are like made for the movie. I just imagine that this song that I'm listening to was made for the book that I'm writing. So how does it apply? What are they talking about? And it's brought up a lot of like really interesting ideas where I'll think like, oh, what if like this is something that represented this thing that happened in the next chapter or whatever it is. So for writer's block overall, I usually just take in other art, whether it's movies, music, drawings, or anything like that. You can get inspiration there. But for the book itself, part of it is just sitting in front of a blank screen and just going through that pain. So I know writers who you feel like you don't have it all together, so you don't write, but you'll never like figure it out. It's usually not going to be some moment of inspiration that like says, oh, I figured it out. I know exactly what's going to happen. It's usually just like sitting in front of a computer and writing 2 sentences and then erasing those 2 sentences and continuing that again and again until something comes together. But that's helped a lot with the book.
Great. I think writer's block is, any advice for writer's block is always helpful. I think breaking through that kind of brain freeze is always, the scariest part of writing.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a question about, you mentioned Stephen King. Someone is asking whether there are any kind of specific Stephen King books that kind of influenced you or kind of played a part in the creation of this book.
Yes, definitely. So I am a big fan of Misery by Stephen King. And that's a story that became a movie with Kathy Bates. The writer gets stranded and she's like his biggest fan and takes him in and everything and makes him write his final novel while she's watching over him. And that helped indirectly with the book as far as the idea. What I really liked about Misery in particular from a writing perspective was that he was under this like terrible situation where he had to write when he didn't want to write. And so Stephen King spoke a lot about the like difficulty that he had in writing. And I guess it was kind of a metaphor for himself and his process of writing. But it was really helpful to kind of, even in like a horror movie or horror film, just hear about someone struggling with writing. And then he would spend chapters talking about, he wrote 10 chapters today, and it was like the greatest moment of his entire life. And then like the next day, nothing worked out. And I just loved it. so I read that while I was working on this and kind of dealing with writer's block and just like, you know what, I'm gonna figure it out and I'll push through. So that was big. And another book that was really, now that I'm thinking about it, I really loved Ready Player One. Ready Player One was an incredible story, really well thought out, and it has similar aspects in the fact that it's a world that's separate from like the real world, but for whoever it's happening to, when you're in it, it's real to you. So that was a big influence too.
Great. We have a comment from someone who's clearly read the book. It's not a question, but they say they can't wait to see if Uko and Tony meet in real life. I think that's kind of a great kind of tension point in the book itself. The will they, won't they kind of thing.
Yeah.
And kind of on the back of that, I have a question about, it's a 3-part series. Did you kind of have a kind of arc in mind from the start of like, this book will be about this book about this book about this? Do you like have the end point in mind, or are you kind of like a George R.R. Martin, kind of like seeing where it takes you?
Yeah, I think that so as far as the Tony and Uko meeting in real life, that's like the number one thing that people ask me. That people are like, I need to see that happen, and and I had to be honest, I haven't decided whether they will, or if they do, how it would fit into the story to kind of seem more authentic and a realistic situation where high school kids would meet in real life who live in completely different states. But and that kind of goes through the process of like making these three books. I had the idea that I wanted three books, and I had a very general idea about what would happen in them. But I definitely didn't like lock down. This is what's going to happen. This is the story. This is the overall arc. Things are still moving as I've changed things as I've talked to people about the book, and so it has a general direction. Like the second book has a much more specific direction, and I have general thoughts for the third book, but it's still something that kind of moves around.
Great. If there are any more questions, as I said earlier, just kind of drop them in the Q&A below, and on Facebook, leave a comment. We have a question from Facebook, and it asks, Monk, if this series was developed into a movie, do you have an idea of who the cast could be? Like, what actors embody the characteristics of your characters?
Oh, that is a good question. I really like Yara Shahidi, who, as far as like visually, she was like kind of the idea for Tony. And so Yara Shahidi she was the oldest daughter on the TV show Blackish, and now she's the main character on Grownish. So if it was to become a movie, that would be like my dream casting. And then for Uko, I'm not sure. I thought about it. I thought of the and I don't remember his name, the boy from Stranger Things. But I don't. I'm less certain on who that would be. I guess if people have ideas, they could send them to me. I just know Yara Shahidi would be like a great Tony.
How about the Chief? Do you have any thoughts on that?
The Chief. So the Chief, who actually would be great for Chief, and a friend of mine suggested this, and then now I can't unsee it. What would be Mahershala Ali, who he was in Green Book. He was also in Moonlight. He would be an incredible Chief. And in the first book, Chief has a role, but it expands in the second book, and you kind of get more of the backstory of why he is the way he is and everything like that.
Cool. I mean, I'm intrigued. We have another question from Facebook. Someone is asking, do you know how old the characters will be at the end of the trilogy?
So that's one of the things that's like moving back and forth. So this, the first one starts in the summer before Uko goes to sixth grade, and then the second one is that school year when he's in sixth grade. So I thought about the third one being significantly later, like 10 years later, and being kind of like showing what has happened in Pangea and with the Nightmare Detectives after the events of the second book, kind of make a big change in the trajectory of this world. And I'm leaning towards that. I'm leaning towards maybe not 10 years, but a period of time where some things have changed, and you're kind of coming into what it looks like at that point. An example of that, like a book that I really like that is not for middle schoolers, but I really like it, is the Handmaid's Tale.
Mm-hmm.
So the Handmaid's Tale, the first one came out in, I think, 1986, and then the sequel just came out. And the sequel is, I think, maybe 15 years later. But it allowed the author to do some interesting things to kind of show, like, if all of these things happen in the first one, what would it look like, fast forward into the future, and how are people interacting and what are the characters doing now. So I'm leaning towards a undisclosed period of time later on.
Cool. We have a couple more questions. Someone asked if there was anything that changed your idea about writing in terms of it made you actually write a book instead of writing for fun.
Instead of writing for fun, I think I saw people doing it, and I had a good support team, a good support system of people who kind of encouraged me to, like, take the next step, who kind of see me. My younger brother was a great support, who seen me writing my entire life, and was one of the people, as well as my wife, who just kind of said, you can do it, and why not take a shot and actually make the book and go that extra mile. And then, of course, when I started, I felt like I couldn't do it, and that same support team was there to help me complete it. But I think it was just that idea of, like, I've seen people do it, and I maybe don't have the confidence to do it myself, but getting pushed by people around me helped me get to that point.
Great. We have someone asking here about if you have inspiration from any other genres, such as anime or cartoons. I know the kind of imagery in the book is great, and you talked a little bit about the kind of the illustrator. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that side of things.
Yeah, I think as far as, like, anime and cartoons, I was a huge fan of Dragon Ball Z growing up, and I know it's come back out recently, but I haven't like caught up on it. But Dragon Ball Z was really something I was really big on. I was really big on Power Rangers when I was younger, and video games were also an influence for the book too. The storytelling in video games, in a good video game, I've played games like The Last of Us, some of the new Tomb Raider games, God of War, where there's a really big focus on just kind of the grandness of everything that's going on, and just like immersing you in this really grand spectacle of a situation. So that was a big influence for some of the areas or some of the nightmares that we're taking on. I kind of wanted to give the reader the idea of this, like, really big thing that was going on all around you, and you were kind of immersed in that experience.
Cool. Another question's come in. Is there anything else that you're working on? And do you have any plans on expanding this world kind of beyond the series into other areas like screenplays, TV pilots, maybe other book series?
Yeah, so I have other things that I've thought of and are in different stages of working on, which has probably been to the detriment of this trilogy, which has kind of pushed it back. But I wrote a screenplay or a pilot for this as like a TV show. I did that, and I envisioned what that would be like, kind of like a Scooby-Doo, where like in Scooby-Doo, there's every episode is a new mystery that they have to solve. You could do something where like every episode is a new nightmare that has to be conquered with some overarching storyline that goes on. But I've done that. I've done some other pilots, and I have an idea for. I'll probably say this for the first time out loud. So I have an idea for a book that is for adults, and it's basically a thriller that follows Ugo's parents at the same time that this is going on, because they have some crazy things going on in their life. So that it'd be like within the world. So I guess if you were a fan of the book, it wouldn't be to the point where like you had to read this book, but you would notice different things that happen, at the same time. But it would be really from the perspective of the parents and what's going on in their life.
Wow. Would that be kind of in the dream world, Pangea, and the sleepwalking world, or would that be kind of more kind of in the so-called real world?
So it'd be specifically just in the real world, and just like their day-to-day life. And like I've had this idea of this they have this like consulting business that they're doing, and they kind of get caught into this conspiracy that's happening while they're, you know, raising Uko and Femi, and while he's going through this transition, they're going through that. And so you would like see moments of it. So since that's been on my mind, I've like thought about where I can place Easter eggs in the Nightmare Detective book, so that later on when that book finally comes out, you can see the connection of like, oh yeah, that's when his parents did X, Y, Z. That's why that happened, those type of things.
Great. I think we've covered most of our questions. If anyone has any more questions, please let us know at the Q&A at the bottom, or comments on Facebook. Monk, I guess on the back of that, I'd kind of be interested to know if like your own personal life has kind of made their way into the book, whether it's kind of your experiences as a child in Newark, or your experience as a parent with children.
Yeah, so I think it definitely has. So one of the big things in the book is Uko has a great set of friends. So he has a neighbor who lives on the same block as him, who has a younger brother, and then Uko and his older brother, they kind of form this group of friends. They call themselves the Council, and they basically are really open to helping each other out and being, you know, genuine with each other and having each other's back. And so growing up in Newark, I had a similar thing. I had a really, really close group of friends. It was probably like 10 of us that all grew up, you know, all within like 1 year of each other in age, the same like apartment complex in North Newark. So that was a big influence for the story, and that kind of friendship that they had. The story kind of came from my childhood and what it was like growing up in Newark.
Cool. We have a few more questions that we'll try and squeeze in before we finish. Someone is asking about any kind of movie influences in your book. Like you have Black Panther kind of plays a role. Are there any kind of movies that influenced the story or shape of the book?
Yeah. So Ready Player One was an influence. That was you know, I read the story and then watched the movie, and that was a big influence. I think another influence, which is probably one of my favorite books, and then they made it into a movie, was The Life of Pi.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, that movie, I think a lot of the influences for the book were kind of the visual influences that you see in Life of Pi, and just that like vivid imagery that you see. And so that was a big influence as well. So I really gravitated to things that were larger than life and really vivid in its in the way that it showed what was happening.
Great. We have a very interesting question right here about our kind of current moment in time. Someone is asking how has the current Black Lives Matter movement impacted how you approach your writing or the stories that you want to write about?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, when I wrote this, or when I started writing this 3 years ago, I always had that feeling that Black and Brown people were underrepresented. We didn't have enough of our stories being told, and there was a disconnect between what the rest of America thought of, you know, our communities and what we thought of our communities. So going into the story and kind of saying, you know, if I'm going to play at least a small part in changing that and showing, you know, what's possible, then that's going to be important to me. And now that what you have now is there's this moment in history where people are realizing that these stories that people have been telling, these complaints that people have had, these issues that this world or this society has had are true, and they are impactful, and they are something that needs to be taken seriously. Everyone's tired of kind of talking about something and not moving forward. So I think that in my writing and the way that I'm talking, even at work and in different areas, is just to be more bold. And less apologetic. You know, as a Black kid, you're kind of taught to take up as little space as possible and not seem like you are trying to impose your will on other people. And I think that people are waking up to the fact that this is a rigged system that is trying to make you less of what you truly are. So it's important to be bold and take up the space that you deserve to take up. So the characters that I write and what I have in mind for the future, I want bold characters that white characters to be that level of impactful, but it's still a political statement when a Black character is. That's how this moment has kind of changed or amplified what I'm doing now.
Great, thank you for that. Great question. So we have time just for this last one. Kind of wraps us up quite nicely. It says, was there anything you've learned while writing or publishing the novel that you kind of maybe didn't realize when you started?
Well, anything I learned. So yeah, I would say the impact that you can have on somebody else's life. I think we think that we can have an impact when we get to a certain level of fame or fortune or something like that. But words have meaning. And so in the process of writing this and giving it to people and having conversations with people who've read it and the way that it's impacted them, it's been extremely humbling and then extremely telling as far as like what you can do with your contribution to the movement, right? So that has been something that I've learned that I would have never known before I did this, and would have never known that something that I thought of and asked people on Facebook about and then decided to write would impact adults and kids from all over the country in the way that it has. So it's been an eye-opening experience.
Great. Well, thank you again, Monk, for joining us. It's been great talking to you and hearing more about the book. I look forward to the next one. And thank you everyone for joining us. Just to kind of let you know other programs we have coming up at the museum. Tomorrow at noon, we have a museum crawl where you can learn about Chinese and Hong Kong art with the Sun Museum in Hong Kong. And on Friday at 7 p.m., we have jazz sessions, an evening with Sheila Anderson, which will be featuring 2 live musicians, and that'll be live on Zoom and Facebook Live. So Monk, thank you again. I look forward to reading more of your work, and I look forward to rereading Nightmare Detective with a whole new perspective.
Thank you, I appreciate that. This was a great time. I appreciate being on here with you.
Great, thanks everyone.
All right, take care.